Welcome, dear listener. Settle in now. Pull whatever is warm a little closer, a blanket, a pillow, the comfortable weight of the sheets around you. Let the room go soft. Let the sounds outside your window settle into the background, the way all sounds eventually do when you're not listening for anything in particular. Take a breath in, long and slow, filling from the belly upward. Hold it for just a moment. I want to take you somewhere tonight, somewhere that does not appear on any map you have ever held in your hands, somewhere that no satellite image has ever captured clearly, not because it is invisible exactly, but because the people who built it were very thoughtful about where they placed it, and very patient about who they told. It is a place that has existed, quietly and purposefully, for a very long time, maintained by people who understood that some kinds of work are best done without an audience. The story begins with a single person, a woman named Alara Voss, who was a government archivist in the way that some people are quietly, precisely exactly the right thing for them to be, not out of compromise. Not for lack of imagination, but because she genuinely loved the work. She loved the order of it. She loved the way documents told stories not in the dramatic, obvious fashion of novels, but in the subtle, accumulated fashion of evidence. A contract from 1953 beside an environmental survey from 1959 beside a decommissioned land assessment from 1967, and if you read them together in the right order, with the right kind of attention, you could begin to see what had actually happened in a place, the true shape of events, not the official one, but the real one, the one that lived in the gaps between what people had written down. She was not supposed to find what she found on the morning we're going to talk about tonight. The universe had not announced its intentions. There was no signal, no dream, no particular presentiment as she drove out of the city into the pale morning light of the Nevada desert. She had a thermos of coffee, a printed set of directions, a work order with a reference number and the expectation of a routine day. She found none of those things. What she found instead would stay with her for the rest of her life, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a gift she had not known she was waiting for, the kind of discovery that does not disturb the world but quietly, permanently deepens it. There is nothing frightening in tonight's story. I want you to know that, right from the beginning. This is not that kind of tale. This is the other kind, the kind that opens rather than tightens, that leaves you feeling, when it is done, more certain of the world than when you began, more trusting of the dark, more comfortable with the idea that the universe contains things you have not yet been introduced to, and that many of those things are waiting to meet you with a patience and a kindness you might not have imagined possible. So let your body sink a little deeper into wherever it is resting tonight. Let your shoulders release. Let your jaw unclench, if it was clenched, and let your breath find its own quiet rhythm. We are going somewhere unhurried. We have all the time we need. We want to thank you for supporting us. We're almost at insert nearest 400 subscribers subs, and it would mean so much if you could support the channel by leaving a like and subscribing to help keep this channel going. Anyways, back to the video. Alara Voss had been driving for 4 hours when the road changed. She was heading toward a records warehouse, a federal storage facility about 90 miles east of the nearest town of any size, in the kind of desert country where the landscape goes on in every direction until it reaches the sky and then continues into it. Nevada in late autumn, silver sage, pale earth, the low scrub of juniper on the slopes of the distant hills, and above everything the enormous and indifferent blue of the sky. She had the radio on, a weather report, then a news program she was not really listening to. Then a stretch of instrumental music that suited the road and the landscape, and she left it there. The work order was simple, a batch of unindexed documents from a site that had been decommissioned in the early 1980s had been flagged for digital transfer as part of a department-wide archival modernization project. Someone needed to physically collect the files, confirm their contents against a manifest, and transport them back to the city for processing. That someone was Alara, because she was available and because she was good at this, at the careful, methodical work of handling old paper, reading old handwriting, understanding the organizing logic of a different era. She had done this dozens of times. It was not glamorous work. It was necessary work, and there was something she found genuinely satisfying about it. The sense of recovering something that might otherwise have been lost, of giving old information a second chance to be useful. To contribute to someone's understanding of something. The county road her navigation specified turned out to be a well-maintained 2-lane strip that ran east into the hills she had been watching approach for the past hour. She followed it for about 20 minutes, which was roughly how long it should have taken to reach the site according to the work order. And then the road curved around a low rise, and she found herself at a junction. There was a road to the right that her navigation did not acknowledge. It was paved, freshly paved, the kind of precise dark asphalt that speaks of regular maintenance, of people who care about the condition of the surface, who come regularly enough to know when it needs attention and respond to that need promptly. It curved away to the east and disappeared behind the slope of the hills. There was nothing to indicate where it went. No signage, no mailboxes, no utility poles, no features of any kind that would typically accompany an inhabited road. Just the road itself, clean and deliberate, heading somewhere. Alara stopped the car and sat with the engine running for a moment. She checked her navigation. She checked her paper map, which she always brought as a backup because she was the kind of person who brought backups. Neither one acknowledged the road. According to both of them, she was looking at undifferentiated open desert. She rolled down her window. The morning air came in, cold and sage-scented and very clean, the kind of air that makes you feel for a moment that you have been breathing inferior air your whole life, and only now understand what the thing is supposed to feel like. A hawk turned in a slow circle far above, riding something invisible upward. The desert was absolutely still. She sat there for a while. She was not afraid. That was worth noting. She was curious, properly, thoroughly curious, the way she got when an archive produced something unexpected, a document in the wrong box, a photograph with a date that did not match. She was alert and attentive, and entirely calm, and then, with the kind of quiet, unfussy decisiveness that characterized most of her significant choices in life, she turned right and followed the road. The hills were closer than they looked, as hills in desert country almost always are. The landscape fools you with its apparent emptiness, makes everything look equidistant, and then the hills are suddenly there, and you have arrived without the gradual sense of approach you might have expected. The road wound between them without drama, following the natural contours of the land as though it had been laid by someone with time to spare, and no interest in forcing a path through terrain that preferred to be treated gently. She noticed things as she drove. The road did not create a visible scar in the landscape from any angle she could see. Whoever had built it had thought carefully about sight lines, about how it would appear from above, about the experience of coming upon it without knowing it was there. It was not hidden exactly, but it was not advertising itself either. It had been designed to be what it was without calling attention to the fact. She drove for perhaps 25 minutes. The hills parted around a final curve. And there, in a wide flat clearing at the base of a slope that had been graded very slightly to ease the transition from the road to the building's entrance, was a structure she had never seen in any document she had ever filed. Low and long and built of stone that matched the colour of the hillside behind it. A pale cream brown that would read, from any distance, as another geological feature, as the natural layering of rock that you saw everywhere in this country if you knew what to look for. The windows were long and set deep in the walls, which made the glass invisible from certain angles. A single door stood in the centre of the facade, made of the same pale stone as the walls, but hinged and slightly ajar, as though someone had just stepped through it moments before she arrived. There were no signs, no fencing, no guardhouses, no cameras that she could see, though she suspected they were there. No vehicles in the clearing. Though there was a space that had clearly been used as a parking area, the gravel packed flat by the weight of something that came and went regularly. Alara sat in her car and looked at the building. The building, insofar as a building can do anything, appeared to wait. She picked up her thermos, poured the last of her coffee, drank it slowly and deliberately. She thought, this is not where I was supposed to go. She thought, this is very interesting. She thought, I am going to go in. She got out of the car and went in. The interior was cool and very clean. That was what struck her first, not the scale of it, which she had not yet registered, or the contents, which would take several minutes to begin to understand. Just the quality of the air inside, cool and clean and still, the kind of stillness that suggests careful climate management, the deliberate maintenance of specific conditions for specific purposes, an archive stillness, the stillness of preserved things. The floor was pale stone, worn smooth in a path down the centre of the main corridor that told her, without any other evidence, that people had been walking here for a very long time. The ceiling was gently vaulted, higher than the exterior of the building had suggested, with a row of small, evenly spaced skylights along the ridge that brought in a soft, diffused daylight without creating any harsh angles. Someone had thought carefully about the light. Someone who understood that the materials stored here would need to be read, and that reading required a light that was useful without being damaging. And the walls. The walls on both sides of the corridor, stretching away from her in both directions as far as she could see, were shelving. Floor to ceiling, bracket mounted, sturdy and plain, holding boxes in precise and unhurried rows. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Each one labelled in a clear, patient script, not printed, handwritten, but with the kind of consistency that comes from a single person doing the same task repeatedly over a very long time, or from several people trained to write in exactly the same way for exactly the same purpose. She walked slowly down the main corridor, reading labels. The dates on the boxes stretched back through the decades: 1980s, 1970s, 1960s. She found a section whose earliest dates read 1947 and stopped. Above this section, mounted at eye level on a small plaque, was a single word: Cygnus. She looked at the plaque for a moment, then she looked further along the corridor and saw another plaque, Orion, and beyond that, another Cassiopeia. She turned and looked behind her at the section she had entered from, Lyra. The archive was organised by constellation, decade after decade of documents, filed not by department or subject or classification level, but by star pattern. She stood in the middle of the corridor and looked at this fact and felt the particular, distinctive sensation that good archives produce, the sense of a filing system that, once understood, reveals everything about the people who built it. She pulled a box from the Cygnus section. Its label read, in that same clear hand, First Observations, 1947 to 1952. Inside were photographs, black and white, printed on paper that had aged to a warm ivory at the edges, each one slipped into a protective sleeve with the care of someone who understood that these would need to be handled again someday, by someone who came later, and that the condition of the paper would matter. The photographs showed the sky above this desert. She recognised the silhouette of the hills, the shape of the horizon, taken at night, with a camera of modest sophistication but considerable patience. Long exposures, stars visible in their thousands. And in some of the photographs, not all of them, but enough shapes that were not stars, not dramatic shapes, not the obvious science fiction geometry of things that announce themselves. These were subtle, elongated forms, somewhat blurred at the edges from whatever motion they had been making at the moment of exposure, arranged in loose formations that suggested relationship without rigidity. 3 in one photograph, 2 in another. Once, a single shape that had remained still long enough to be captured with relative clarity, smooth-sided, slightly luminous, oriented in a direction that was not quite horizontal and not quite vertical. Below each photograph was a handwritten notation: calm, precise, the language of careful observation rather than of excitement or alarm. She read through them slowly, standing in the corridor with the box resting on her forearm. 3 craft observed moving south-southeast at approximately 2300 hours. Velocity inconsistent with known aviation. No sound detectable, movement characterised by a smoothness that suggests either very high altitude or a propulsion method that does not produce the turbulence associated with jet or propeller aircraft. Observers, 5 staff, all present, all accounted for. Duration of observation, approximately 14 minutes before objects moved beyond the range of visual tracking. Weather, clear, no atmospheric interference. Feeling among observers, calm. Primary response, curiosity. She read that word again, curiosity. Not fear, not alarm, curiosity. She moved further into the box. The logs continued, methodical and unhurried, through the late 1940s and into the early 1950s. Sightings were not common. Sometimes months elapsed between entries, but they were consistent enough to constitute a pattern, and the people writing these logs had clearly recognised that. They had begun, by the early 1950s, to cross-reference individual sightings with astronomical records with weather data, with each other's independent accounts. They were building a dataset. They were treating this the way scientists treat any repeated phenomenon, with observation, with documentation, with the patience to let the data accumulate before reaching for conclusions. She found a section labelled simply Responses. She opened the first box. Inside were radio transcripts, printed on equipment she recognised from her archival work as early computing output, the slightly smudged, slightly irregular print of machines that were doing their best in the infancy of their own technology. The transcripts recorded signals transmitted from this location on frequencies she did not immediately recognise, and beside each transmission, in the same careful hand, a record of what had been received in return. The responses were described in mathematical language, intervals, sequences, patterns of repetition that she could not immediately pass, but that had clearly been analysable, because beside each description of a received signal was a brief analytical notation. Prime sequence, third iteration. Geometric ratio, variable. Repeat of initial transmission, modified. She stood in the cool quiet of the archive and held that word in her mind for a moment. Something had been receiving their transmissions and sending back modifications, variations, responses that were not identical to what had been sent but were clearly related to it, the way a conversation is related to whatever initiated it. Call and response, question and answer, not in words, in mathematics, in the language that does not require translation because it's the same everywhere, in every mind that has learned to think in terms of number and pattern and relation. She put the box back carefully with both hands and straightened the label. She was not afraid. She thought about that as she walked further down the corridor. She thought, why am I not afraid? And the answer she arrived at was this: because the people who built this place were not afraid. It was in everything they had written. The tone of the logs was not the tone of people who were suppressing panic or managing dread. It was the tone of people who had seen something that genuinely delighted and engaged them, and had responded to that delight by doing what engaged and delighted people always do, paying very close attention. She was not alone for long. Footsteps behind her, unhurried, unalarmed, and she turned to find a man at the far end of the corridor, slight in build and perhaps 70 years old, wearing the plain, practical clothing of someone who spends most of their time doing actual useful work. He was looking at her without surprise, without alarm, with the calm, unhurried expression of someone who's been expecting. For some time that a particular thing will happen, and finds that it is now happening exactly as expected. "My name is Henry," he said. "You're from the archives office. We have been hoping someone would come." His voice was the gentlest possible kind of calm, not the performed calm of someone managing their anxiety, but the genuine calm of someone who has spent so long with one thing that the thing no longer produces anxiety, only interest. He led her through the facility without rushing, pausing when she paused, answering her questions as she asked them, not volunteering more than she was ready for. The building was considerably larger than it appeared from outside. The main corridor ran the full length of the structure, but branching off it on both sides were rooms she had not anticipated. Workrooms, quiet and neatly arranged, with long tables holding maps and charts and printed astronomical data. A room given over entirely to radio equipment. Older and newer generations of it coexisting, the earlier machines kept in working order alongside their successors, because everything here was kept in working order, because nothing was considered finished or superseded if it still had something to offer. There was a room with a long table and chairs where she imagined meetings took place, though meetings seemed too formal a word for whatever conversations happened in this place. There were sleeping quarters, simple and orderly in the monastic way that spaces become when they are lived in by people who have chosen to live very close to their work. And there was a kitchen, warm and domestic and entirely at odds with everything she had expected, where a pot of something was simmering on the stove and the smell of it settled the last of whatever ambient tension she might have been carrying without knowing it. 4 people lived and worked here, Henry explained. Himself and his wife, Mara, who had come together 40 years ago from a research institution neither of them still formally affiliated with. A young physicist named Daniel, who had arrived the previous year looking for an explanation for something in his data, and had found instead a much larger question, and had stayed because the larger question was more interesting than anything waiting for him elsewhere. and an elderly woman named Constance, who was resting now but would be glad to meet her later. Constance, who had been here longer than any of them, who had written the earliest of the logs she had been reading in the archive, who had been 26 years old when she first came to this desert and had simply, quietly, never left. None of them were employed by any organisation Alara could name. None of them received a government salary. The facility operated on an endowment. Henry was gently vague about the details, in the way of someone who has learned that some information is best held lightly. Established decades ago by someone who had believed this work was important enough to fund quietly and long-term, and without institutional interference. "What is the work?" she asked. She asked it simply, because it seemed like the right question, and because Henry seemed like someone who would give it a real answer. He paused. Not the pause of someone searching for words, but the pause of someone considering which true thing to say first. "Paying attention," he said finally. "We are paying attention, carefully and consistently and over a very long time, so that if the moment comes when attention needs to be accompanied by response, by something more than observation, we will have accumulated enough understanding to respond well." He set his mug down and looked out the long window at the desert beyond, and his expression was one she could not quite name. It was the expression of someone who loves what they look at, who has looked at it long enough that the love is no longer excited but steady. The way you love something you have chosen to commit to, the way love becomes part of how you see. "Has the moment come?" she asked. He smiled, the small, private smile of someone sitting with a question they have been sitting with for a very long time. "We think it may be approaching," he said, "which is why we're glad you found the road." That afternoon, Mara showed her the deep archive. It was a separate room, accessible through a door in what had appeared to be a solid section of stone wall, until Mara pressed a particular point in it, and a seam appeared, and the door swung inward on hinges that moved without sound. The air inside was noticeably cooler than the main corridor, kept that way on purpose, Mara explained, climate controlled for preservation. They kept the temperature consistent year-round, regardless of what the desert outside was doing. And the desert outside was doing quite different things in January than it was in July. There were cases down the centre of the room, long, low, glass-topped cases of the kind you might find in a museum, evenly lit from within, their contents resting on pale archival foam. Each case was labelled with the same careful handwriting she recognised from the main archive. Each label included a date, a location, and a brief description of the circumstances of the item's acquisition. She walked along the cases slowly, reading. The first item was a disc, approximately the diameter of a large coin, made of something that resembled metal without being metal. It had the colour and surface texture of brushed aluminum. But when Mara told her the composition had been analysed by 3 independent laboratories over 30 years, and none of them had been able to identify it with certainty, she understood why the label did not specify. Recovered from the site of a ground-level landing in 1961, the label read, emits a harmonic frequency in the 400 Hz range when in proximity to living tissue. No mechanism for this emission has been identified. No battery, no active component of any kind. It simply does this. The second item was a piece of something like fabric, folded carefully, the folds preserved in their original configuration by the archival foam beneath it. It shifted colour when Mara changed the angle of the light. Blue, then a deep green, then something she could not name but that she found, looking at it, unexpectedly calming. Like looking at deep water from a sufficient distance. Found on the surface of a dry lake bed following a sighting in 1978, the label read. Appears to have been left deliberately. No disturbance of the surrounding surface that would suggest accidental loss. No other material of this kind found in proximity. The third case held something that took her longer to look at because she was not immediately sure what she was looking at. It was small, she could have held it in 2 cupped hands, and it was covered in a pattern of circular indentations arranged in concentric rings. She thought of it initially as decorative, but the longer she looked, the less certain she was. The indentations were too precisely distributed for ornament, too consistent in their spacing. Whatever they were, they had been put there with enormous care, by something or someone for whom care was simply the expected mode of doing things. Delivered to the facility's original director at precisely 4 a.m, July 12th, 1983, the label read, "No craft was observed, no personnel were observed." Constance opened the door at 4:02 in the morning because she said, a feeling. It was on the step. It has not changed in any detectable way in the 40 years since. Ilara stood in front of this case for a long time. Mara stood beside her, quiet and unhurried, the way you are with someone who needs time and you have time to give them. "I am not afraid of this," Ilara said eventually. She meant it as an observation, a data point about her own experience, offered in the spirit of the place she was in, which was a place that valued honest observation. "I know," Mara said. Neither was Constance. She stood on the step in the dark, holding this for quite a while before she brought it inside. And she has written that what she felt was not fear, but something closer to being recognised, as though the fact of its having been left for her to find meant that someone, somewhere, believed she was the right person to have it, that she was trustworthy enough, that she had been paying attention well enough, that she had earned this particular mystery by the quality of her attention to all the others. "This is not a secret facility in the way you might be imagining," Mara continued. "Not secret in the sense of something hidden because it is shameful, or hidden because power wants to keep it. It is quiet because quiet is what it needs in order to function. Because some things can only happen in conditions of patience and continuity. And patience and continuity are very difficult to maintain when many eyes are watching and many voices are making demands. There will be a time when what we know here becomes part of what the world knows. We believe that time is coming, but it has not arrived yet, and until it does, the work continues quietly, as it always has." "And is the world ready?" Ilara asked. Mara considered this the way everyone here seemed to consider things, without rushing, without performing consideration, actually doing it. "It is beginning to be," she said, "and that for now is enough." She met Constance that evening just before dinner. The old woman was in a chair by one of the long windows, watching the desert move from the gold of late afternoon into the deeper amber that comes just before the light fails. She turned when Ilara entered with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who has made peace with the pace of their body, not fighting it, simply working with it, moving at the speed that the body now preferred and finding that speed entirely adequate. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes were the clear grey of old glass, the kind of glass that does not distort what it shows you, only holds it. She'd come in 1959, she said, 26 years old, a physics degree, and a letter from a mentor she trusted completely. She'd been told only that there was unusual work being done in the Nevada desert, work that required someone with her particular combination of skills and temperament, and that it was not the kind of work she could discuss with anyone outside of it. She had come for what she told herself would be a summer. The summer had become a year. The year had become the rest of her life, and looking back on it now, she could not find in herself the smallest particle of regret. "I know what you're thinking," Constance said. She said it without archness, without performance, a simple statement of fact. "You're thinking, how do you decide to stay? How do you leave everything else behind?" Ilara said that this was approximately what she had been thinking. "I didn't leave anything behind," Constance said. "The things I might have done instead, the career I was being prepared for, the life I'd been imagining, those were estimates, projections, guesses about what would be meaningful. What I found here was actual meaning, already present, already happening. I didn't choose between options of equal weight. I found the thing that was already real and I stayed with it." She looked out at the darkening desert, the sky above it beginning to bloom with early stars. She had been the one to establish the classification system, Constance continued, the constellations. Because from the earliest observations she had noticed that certain phenomena occurred more frequently in association with certain parts of the sky. Not directly in the direction of a constellation, obviously, since the constellations are a human imposition on the randomness of stellar distribution, but along the same band of sky, the same general arc from horizon to zenith. It had seemed meaningful. It had turned out to be meaningful. The classification had helped her find patterns across decades of data that would have been invisible without that organising principle. She had been the one to begin the communications attempts. She described this matter-of-factly, without any sense of the magnitude of what she was saying, the way you describe something you have done so many times that the doing of it no longer strikes you as remarkable. She had been broadcasting mathematical sequences since 1962. Not continuously. Equipment limitations and funding realities had imposed gaps, but consistently enough that she believed, and the data supported the belief, that the pattern of transmission was recognizable from the other end. And she had been the one to find the device on the front step. She described that morning with the same matter-of-fact calm she brought to everything. A feeling, she said. Not unusual, she had learned, over years of paying very close attention, to notice her own intuitive responses to the data, to treat them as data rather than as noise. She had been lying awake the way she sometimes did in the deepest hours of the night, and she had felt a kind of alertness that was different from her ordinary insomnia, and she'd gotten up and gone to the door and opened it. It was on the step. She had stood there in the cold, dark desert night holding it, feeling the faint harmonic resonance of it through her palms, and she had understood with the completeness that comes only from years of preparation that something had decided to leave her a gift. Not a threatening gift, not a challenging gift. A gift in the oldest, simplest sense, something offered by one being to another as an acknowledgement of relationship, as a recognition of shared attention. She had brought it inside. She had documented it with the same care she documented everything. She had kept broadcasting. And then something changed, Elara said. Constance looked at her with those clear eyes. Then the broadcast changed, she said. What had been simple, our transmissions and their modifications, call and response, the basic grammar of intention, became more complex. Not on our side, on theirs. The responses began carrying more information than we had sent. Structures we had not originated. Patterns that were not variations on our transmissions, but entirely new contributions to the exchange, as though something had been listening long enough to understand the language well enough to add to it, as though we had passed some threshold of consistency, or patience, or seriousness, and something had decided we were ready for more. Outside, the desert had gone fully dark. The stars were extraordinary, the dense, numerous, overwhelming stars of a place far from any artificial light. The sky full in a way that most people who live in cities have never seen and cannot quite believe when they encounter it. Elara had grown up in cities. She had not known the sky could look like this. She had not known there were so many. Constance watched her watching them. That is how it begins, the old woman said quietly. You simply look up. You give your attention to it, without agenda, without demand, without expecting anything in return. And after enough time, enough consistent, patient, open attention, you begin to notice that something is looking back. She stayed 3 days. She had meant to stay 1. On the first morning she had asked if she could spend more time in the archive, and Henry had said yes, simply and immediately, without conditions or caveats, and she had spent the rest of the day reading. On the second morning she had woken before dawn and gone to the main workroom and found Mara there already, working quietly by the light of a single lamp, and they had talked for several hours about what the archive contained and what it meant and what the people who had created it had understood about the nature of what they were doing. And on the third morning, Daniel the physicist had shown her his work, and that had kept her until midday without question. Daniel was the youngest person in the facility by many years. He had the energy of someone who is working on a problem they find genuinely fascinating. Not frantic energy, not the performance of productivity, but the real thing. A kind of focused aliveness that you can feel when you're near someone who's engaged in exactly the right work at exactly the right moment in their development. He had arrived the previous year with data he could not explain, and an expectation that the explanation would be simple. He was now working on something considerably larger and was not, he said, even slightly sorry. The signal has been changing, he told her. He spread printouts across the workroom table, long scrolls of waveform data, comparison charts, statistical analyses, and began walking her through what he had found. The primary signal, the one Constance had been receiving and responding to for decades, was still there. The mathematical sequences, the prime patterns, the call and response structure. But beneath it, over the past 18 months, something additional had been accumulating. Layers, he said. He described it with the calm, technical language of someone who has lived with a problem long enough that even its most extraordinary aspects have become familiar. Beneath the primary signal, at frequency ranges that were adjacent to but not coincident with the main transmission, were secondary structures. Not random. That had been the first thing he had verified, and he had verified it 6 different ways because the alternative hypothesis, That this was all very interesting noise was too important to dismiss before he was absolutely certain it was wrong. Not random, structured, organised according to mathematical principles that were related to but more complex than the principles in the primary signal. It is building on itself, he said. Each layer references the ones beneath it. The mathematical relationships between them are too precise and too consistent to be accidental. Whatever is producing this signal is doing it intentionally and coherently, and has been doing it for at least 18 months, possibly longer. We did not have the analytical framework to see the secondary layers until recently. The signal has been teaching us how to see it. She heard that sentence and something in her shifted slightly, the way things shift when a piece of information lands precisely where it was always going to land. It has been teaching you how to see it, she repeated. That is the only description that fits, Daniel said. The primary signal established the framework, taught us the basic grammar, the fundamental mathematical vocabulary. And then, once the framework was in place, once we had demonstrated that we could use it, additional information began appearing that uses that framework to communicate something more complex. We could not have understood the secondary layers without the primary signal. We could not have found the secondary layers without having spent years learning to read the primary one. He looked at her steadily. I know how this sounds, he said. I know how it sounds, she agreed. What does it say? He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the desert was brilliant with midday light, everything reduced to its essential geometry, the pale earth, the dark sage, the hard edge of shadow at the base of the hills. It describes a location, he said. That is what we have been able to determine so far. The secondary signal encodes what appears to be a precise spatial temporal coordinate, not a location in space, at least not only. More like a location in the relationship between space and time, a point in the structure of things, he paused. We believe it may be an invitation to understand something, to recognize something we have not yet recognized. To arrive, conceptually at least, or perhaps in some other way we do not yet understand, at a particular place in our own development. Ilara thought about the log she had read in the first archive box. The most recent entry, written in that familiar careful hand. The pattern has changed. We believe it may now be an invitation. That was 2 years ago, she said. 2 years ago, he confirmed. And in the 2 years since, the signal has continued to elaborate. Each month, a little more. Each new layer building on the ones before it, moving towards something. She sat with that for a moment. The desert light outside was enormous and unhurried. Toward what? She asked. Toward us being ready to receive it, Daniel said. That is what it feels like. That is what the data suggests. It is not transmitting a message we could simply receive tomorrow and be done with. It is transmitting the conditions for a message. Building the capacity in us to understand something that will come when the capacity is complete. She thought about patience, about what it meant to wait. Not passively, not emptily, but actively. Maintaining something across decades, across generations, because the thing you're waiting for is worth the waiting. She thought about Constance, 67 years in this desert. She thought about the device on the front step, delivered at 4 a.m. by something that had decided the person inside was ready to receive it. She thought, this is what it looks like when something takes its time. On her last night, something happened. She'd gone to bed in the small spare room they had given her, lying in the clean desert dark, listening to a silence so complete she could hear her own pulse. She was not distressed. She was not worried. She was simply present in the quiet, the way you can be present in a place that has earned your attention, and she let the quiet hold her and tried to let sleep come. She was somewhere between waking and sleeping when she heard soft footsteps in the corridor. Then the low murmur of voices, then the sound of equipment, subtle, electronic, the kind of background hum that belongs to rooms where instruments are working. She lay still for a moment, and then rose and dressed and followed the sounds. All 4 of them were in the main workroom, Daniel at the equipment, hands moving with the focus of someone who has stopped thinking about what their hands are doing and is simply doing it. Henry standing behind him, watching the screens. Mara at the long window looking out at the desert, though there was nothing visible in the dark outside, only the dark itself. Constance in the centre of the room, in her chair, hands folded in her lap, perfectly still. What is it? Ilara said from the doorway. The signal, Daniel said without looking up. Something new about 20 minutes ago, an additional layer, more complex than anything in the historical data. This is not elaboration on what we have been receiving. This is a new transmission. He pulled up a visualization on the center screen. Ilara moved closer to see it. What she saw was beautiful. She thought that word immediately and then thought, that is not a scientific response. And then, but it is an honest one. The visualization showed a three-dimensional structure rotating slowly against a field of data points. Nested geometric forms, each one precise and symmetrical, each one relating to the ones inside and outside it. According to mathematical principles, she could feel the elegance of even without being able to articulate them. It was like looking at something that had always existed, but that she was seeing for the first time. Like a word you have always known but are only now hearing spoken aloud. Can you read it? She asked. Parts, Daniel said. The mathematical substrate is consistent with what we have been receiving. But the structure it is describing is, he paused, and in the pause she heard something she had not heard from him before. Wonder. The undisguised, unmanaged wonder of someone encountering something genuinely beyond their expectation. It is describing a location, he said, in time. The room was very quiet. Outside, the desert stars blazed without comment. Constance sat in the centre of the room and her face was calm with the calm of someone who has recognised what they are witnessing. Not surprised, not alarmed, but settled in the way of someone who's been waiting for a particular thing and is now watching it arrive. What does that mean? Ilara said. A location in time. We do not know yet, Henry said, but we will learn. That is always how it goes here. We observe, and we document, and we sit with what we do not understand until understanding arrives on its own schedule. An understanding always arrives, eventually, if you are patient enough and attentive enough and do not try to force it before it is ready. Ilara sat down on the nearest available chair. The signal continued to unfold on the screens. New geometric relationships appearing, new layers of pattern becoming visible as Daniel's software processed the incoming data and rendered it in forms that could be seen and contemplated. She watched it for a long time without speaking. The others watched it too. The room breathed around them, 5 people in a building in a desert that did not appear on any map, watching something that should not have been possible, and was not only possible but was happening. It was right there on the screens, patient and precise and extraordinarily beautiful. The night passed slowly. No one slept. There was tea at some point. Constance asked Daniel once, in a very quiet voice, to adjust one of the analytical parameters, and he did, and a new aspect of the signal became visible, and Constance looked at it for a long time and said, "Yes, I thought so." Just before dawn, Daniel looked up from his screens with the expression of someone who has just arrived at a conclusion they have been approaching for a long time. "I believe it is asking a question," he said. "The structure of the new transmission, the way it ends, the relationship of the final element to everything before it, is interrogative. It is asking something. And my best current interpretation of what it is asking is, are you ready?" Constance, without moving, without changing the quality of her stillness, said, "Tell it yes." Daniel looked at her. The pale light of the coming dawn was beginning to appear at the windows. Not light yet exactly, but a softening of the dark, the sky moving from black toward that deep luminous blue that belongs to the last moments before sunrise. "Tell it yes." Constance said again, "We have been working toward this for 67 years. I am ready. I believe we all are. Tell it yes." Daniel turned back to his equipment. His hands moved. A transmission went out from the desert into the early morning sky, carrying a mathematical structure that meant, as clearly as mathematics could mean anything, "Yes, we hear you. We are here. We are ready." Then they waited. The sun rose. The desert went from blue-grey to gold. The coffee was made. They sat with their cups and watched the screens and waited. The response came 3 hours later. It was not what any of them had expected. It was not more of the same. It was simpler, far simpler. A single, clear, unelaborated mathematical structure that Daniel translated with one word. "Good," he said. Just that. Whatever was on the other end of this exchange had received their response, and had replied with the mathematical equivalent of good. Constance closed her eyes. Her expression was the most private thing Alara had ever seen on a human face. The expression of someone receiving, after a very long time, exactly what they had been waiting for. "Good," the old woman repeated softly. "Yes, good." She drove away the following morning as the sun was climbing above the hills and the desert was moving from gold into the bright, honest white of full day. She had agreed to certain things before leaving. She would not disclose the location of the facility in any official document. She would not report what she'd seen in any form that might direct attention to it from directions that could not be controlled. She would, where her work gave her the opportunity, ensure that no administrative or archival process accidentally brought the facility into official sight before the people there were ready for it to be seen. She had agreed to all of this without pressure and without hesitation, because everything she had experienced in those 3 days made the agreement feel like the obvious choice, not a concealment, but a continuation of care. She thought, driving back along the road that did not appear on any map, about what she had read and seen and heard. She thought about the archive and its meticulous records, the handwriting consistent across decades of different writers who had been trained in the same careful hand. She thought about the objects in the deep archive, modest and extraordinary in equal measure, held in their glass cases with the respect you give things that have come a long way to find you. She thought about the signal evolving on Daniel's screens in the pre-dawn dark, patient and beautiful, and building towards something she could feel, but not yet see. The signal has been teaching us how to see it. She kept returning to that sentence, not transmitting a complete message, but transmitting the conditions for understanding a message, building the capacity in the receiver to receive what would eventually be sent. She thought about her own work, the documents she filed, the records she maintained, the slow accumulation of organised information that allowed the future to understand the past. She thought about how much of what was most important in any archive was not the individual document, but the relationship between documents, the pattern that emerged when many things were held together with patience and order over a long period of time. She thought about how that was not so different from what Constance had been doing for 67 years in the desert, accumulating, organising, holding things with care across time so that the pattern they formed could eventually become visible. She thought, perhaps this is what I was made for, not the particular place in the archive I have always worked, but the skill of it, the patience of it, the willingness to maintain something over time without demanding that it resolve on my schedule. The highway appeared and she merged onto it, the comfortable anonymity of the road resuming around her, other cars, other destinations, the full ordinary morning of a world going about its business. She turned the radio on, news, weather, the familiar texture of the world she had always inhabited. Everything the same as before she had turned off onto the unmarked road, everything exactly the same and also quietly and permanently different. She drove for a while thinking about nothing in particular, which is to say thinking about everything, the way you do when something important has happened and your mind has not yet decided how to hold it. And then, as the first distant outlines of the city appeared on the horizon, she became aware of something she had not paid attention to in a long time. The sky, the enormous, patient sky above the highway, full of the same daylight it was always full of, holding the same distance it always held. She looked at it through the windshield with the attention she had learned in those 3 days to bring to the visible world, and it looked the same as it always had, and it looked, also, completely different, full in a way she had not noticed before, present in a way that presence is when you have been reminded that presence is something worth noticing. She thought, it will be all right. She thought this not as reassurance, not as the suppression of anxiety, but as a genuine conclusion arrived at by evidence. She had seen the care with which this had been managed, by the people in the facility, yes, but also by whatever had been on the other side of the signal for all these decades. The patience of it, the incremental, careful, unhurried approach, the willingness to wait until the receiver was ready rather than transmitting before the connection, was strong enough to hold the weight of what needed to be said. Whatever was coming, whatever the location in time turned out to mean, whatever invitation had been extended, it was going to be handled well. It was going to be handled with the same extraordinary care that had characterized every element of the exchange so far. And whatever humanity turned out to be ready for, it would be met at exactly that level, no more and no less. She thought, patience is not absence. She thought, waiting is not nothing, not. She thought, 67 years in a desert paying attention can be the most important thing a person does with their life. She filed her report the following week. Unremarkable, she wrote. Facility located and accessed per protocol. Documents collected and transported. No anomalies noted. Chain of custody confirmed. She was not lying exactly. The anomalies were not hers to note in that document. They belonged to a longer story, a story with its own timeline, its own requirements, its own conditions for what should be disclosed when and to whom. She had learned enough in 3 days in the desert to understand that. She had understood it well enough to agree to be part of the system of care that maintained the conditions for the story to unfold properly. She put the report in its folder and placed it in the correct drawer and went back to her ordinary work. Land surveys, environmental assessments, the accumulated paper evidence of the world going about its business across decades. She handled it with the same care she had always handled it, and now, also, with a kind of additional attention, a second layer of awareness she had not had before, that noticed patterns in what might otherwise have seemed like simple, administrative documentation, that looked for the gaps, the absences, the places where records stopped and did not resume. She did not find anything as significant as what she had found in the desert. She had not expected to, but she looked, and the looking was its own kind of practice. She thought often about Constance, about what it would be like to have chosen, at 26, to stay with something for the rest of your life. Not out of stubbornness or failure to imagine alternatives, but out of genuine recognition. The moment when you understand that the thing in front of you is the most important thing you will ever find, and you respond to that understanding by stopping the search and simply being where you are. She was not 26. She had been other places, done other things, accumulated a life full of ordinary choices and ordinary satisfactions. But she was not old either, and she had, in 3 days in a desert building that did not appear on any government record, encountered the most extraordinary thing she had ever encountered. And the extraordinary thing had not resolved neatly into something she could describe and file and move past. It had opened. It had left her with more to understand than she had had before, and the understanding was still happening, would keep happening for years, she suspected, in the same incremental, layered, patient way that everything in this particular story seemed to happen. She went back once in the spring. Henry met her at the junction and drove her in. The road still unmarked, still invisible on every map she owned. Constance was thinner, but her eyes were as clear as before. Daniel showed her the new data, which was more complex than what she had seen in the autumn, and which he explained with the same patient enthusiasm he brought to everything. The signal was still evolving. The exchange was still ongoing. Whatever the location in time meant, they were getting closer to being able to understand it. Or, which might amount to the same thing, it was getting closer to them. She sat with Constance that evening in the window chairs, watching the desert darken. She had brought a question she'd been holding since the autumn, waiting for the right moment to ask it. "Are you afraid?" she said. "Now that it is, accelerating. Now that whatever is coming is closer. Are you afraid?" Constance considered this with the full weight of her attention, which was considerable. "I was afraid," she said in the very beginning, "not of what I had seen, the sightings, the signals. Those never frightened me, but of the size of it, of what it meant if it was real, of standing at the edge of something that large and looking in." She paused. The last light was leaving the sky above the hills, and the first stars were appearing, tentative and then certain. "But you cannot stand at the edge of something for 67 years and stay afraid of it," she said. "Fear requires novelty. The thing I am watching is no longer novel. It is my life. It is the context in which everything I have done has happened. How do you fear the context you exist in?" She was quiet for a moment. The stars were multiplying above them, filling in from the brightest to the faintest, the sky completing itself in the patient way it always does. "What I feel now," she said, "is not fear. What I feel is something more like readiness. The readiness of someone who has spent a very long time preparing for something and can feel that the preparation is almost complete. Not impatience, not urgency. Just the quiet recognition that the moment you have been working toward is approaching, and you are going to be present for it, and you are, as nearly as it is possible for a human being to be, ready. Elara sat with that for a long time. The desert went fully dark around them. The stars accumulated overhead in their hundreds and thousands, the vast, dense stars of a place far from any city, more numerous and more various than the sky that most people see. She looked at them with the attention she'd learned. She thought, yes, she thought, I am beginning to understand. She thought, this is the oldest story. Not the story of encounter, though that is part of it. The oldest story is the one about attention, about what happens when you pay attention to something for long enough, about what that attention eventually allows you to see, about the patience of the universe and the patience that it asks of us in return, about the quiet, extraordinary discovery that looking up, consistently and openly, without agenda and without demand, is itself a form of communication, that the attention is itself the message, that what we call waiting is actually already a conversation. She flew home the next morning in the early light, the desert below her from the airplane window looking exactly like what it was. An enormous pale expanse of land that went on until it met the hills, and the hills went on until they met the sky. No sign from above of any structure at all, no road, no building, only the land and the sage and the shadows of the early morning, and above it, already beginning to fade in the growing daylight, the last few stars. And so we come, dear listener, to the place where the story rests. Not ends, because stories like this one do not end exactly. They continue somewhere beyond the edge of what we can see, patient and ongoing, the way the signal continues in the desert, the way the stars continue above the city, the way the universe continues being what it is regardless of whether anyone is currently paying attention to it. Let your body sink a little deeper now into wherever it is resting. Let the weight of the day dissolve, the way it always does, gradually and without drama. You do not need to hold anything tonight. You do not need to understand anything. The things that matter will still be there when morning comes, patient and unhurried and entirely willing to wait. Somewhere in a desert that does not appear on any map, 4 people are sitting with their instruments and their patience and the long accumulation of their attention. And something, across a distance we do not yet have words for, is waiting with a patience that makes theirs look brief. And the signal continues to elaborate layer by careful layer, teaching the world to read something it was not yet ready to read when the teaching began, and is becoming, slowly and surely, ready for now. You are safe. You are still. You are held in the night the way everything is held in the night, without effort, without condition, exactly as you are. Let your breathing slow to its own quiet rhythm. Let your thoughts become soft, like sounds heard from a distance, interesting but not urgent, moving at their own pace and not requiring anything from you. Let sleep come the way it always comes when you stop trying to find it, gradually and then completely, like the stars appearing one by one and then all at once. Rest now. The facility is keeping watch. The signal is still there. The universe is patient, and it has been patient for a very long time, and it will be patient for a very long time more. There is nothing to resolve tonight, nothing to understand, nothing to do but breathe and be still, and let the quiet do what the quiet does. Sleep well, the stars are still there, they always are. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to watch more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue creating more content. Anyways, see you in the next one.